A very warm welcome to all of you. Until now in this course, we've been looking at various theories and concepts in migration research. Now in today's class, we will study a seminal paper by Stephen Castles that discusses some of the problems in theory formation in migration research with a specific focus on international migration. Now the question is, why is theorizing so difficult in migration research? And why is theorizing so difficult in migration studies? This is something that we are going to look at, and this conversation will continue over the next few lectures in the next couple of weeks and indeed through the rest of the course. So Stephen Castles, in his paper titled Understanding Global Migration, a Social Transformation Perspective, argues that the general theory of migration is neither possible nor desirable. However, what Castles says is that what we need to do is to re-embed migration research in a more general understanding of contemporary society. So therefore, while a general theory of migration is not possible or desirable, Castles argues that we need to link migration to broader theories of social change. And this is something that needs to be done across a range of social scientific disciplines. So now some scholars have argued that migration, which is the long-term movement from one nation state to another following patterns of labor settlement, is an outdated concept. And it's an outdated concept. It belongs to the 19th and 20th centuries, and in the 21st centuries we should be more concerned with mobilities. Now what is mobilities? Now mobilities is something which is brought about by changes in transportation, technology, culture, making it normal for people to think beyond borders, to cross them frequently for the purpose of education, marriage, retirement, lifestyle, etc. On the other hand, others have pointed out that mobility is not the new normal, right? And so there is a, why is mobility not the new normal? Because the right to be mobile is more class specific than ever, and it's more selective than ever. We know that national border controls and international cooperation on migration management have become highly restrictive. Most people also don't have either the economic means or the political rights which are needed to be able to be mobile. And in 2020, only 3.6% of the world's population was international migrants, right? So therefore, this whole postmodern utopia of a borderless world of mobility has not really arrived, and so Castles argues it's still appropriate to focus on migration rather than mobility. So this migration mobility debate can be located in a wider political discourse. In the previous class, we spoke about migration infrastructure and migration industry, you might remember. And so we need to understand that a combination of demographic, economic and social factors make developed economies highly reliant on immigrant labor. And over here specifically, international recruitment of highly skilled labor is valued, whereas low skilled labor is undesired. So therefore, what we have is a construction of binaries. Even though both types of migrant labor are necessary for the destination society, you have a construction of binaries: professional mobility versus unwanted migration, or professional skilled mobility versus unwanted labor migration. So therefore, in this kind of a construct, Castles argues that mobility equals good because it is a badge of a modern open society, whereas migration equals bad because it's reawakened archaic memories of invasion, of displacement. And in this context, Castles argues that it is a focus on migration rather than mobility that better reflects real power relations. Now, there is a dominant political discourse that sees migration as a problem that needs to be fixed. How do we fix this problem? We fix it by appropriate policies. Now, the fact that migration is a problem, or the perspective that migration is a problem, comes from several roots, right? Now, And how do we fix migration as a problem? So one is, of course, by tight border controls in destination countries. That is seen as a policy fix. The other way in which migration, the problem of migration can be fixed is seen in source area societies, right? And so you have a lot of policy prescriptions that highlight rural development, that argue that addressing the root causes of migration, such as poverty, lack of livelihoods in source areas, can be useful in controlling migration or fixing migration as a problem. Now you see, in this discourse, migration is seen as something that's harmful, something that's dysfunctional, something that needs to be contained, something that needs to be stopped, and Oliver Bakewell calls this sedentary bias. What is sedentary bias? Sedentary bias, Bakewell argues, is a long tradition which started with colonial policies and is continued by most contemporary development agencies. And clearly what it does is, it argues that the poor constitute a threat to prosperity and public order if they move, therefore the poor should stay at home. And now over here, as we have discussed briefly, that rich countries need migrant workers. And this whole current expression of sedentary bias is not a prohibition of south-north movements. What Castles is arguing is that in today's day and age, sedentary bias gets manifested in the idea of circular migration. The idea that migration is a triple win. It's a win-win-win for source regions, destination regions, and migrants themselves, right? And we will discuss circular migration at length in another lecture. But for now, it's really important to kind of understand that the idea that migration is a problem, the idea that this problem can be fixed by appropriate policies, is something which is very, very predominant. And this is also rooted in sedentary bias. And sedentary bias, of course, is the bias towards immobility, right? State policies always focus on development as is at a particular location without movement, right? But given the context of the necessity of migration, specifically in labor importing countries, you have the perspective of circular migration being beneficial. So migration is not seen as a problem in these contexts where there is a need for immigrant labor in destination societies. Instead, circular migration is seen as a policy solution. And what is circular migration really? You have migrant labor going and working at destination society wherever there are shortages, and then eventually returning back to the source region. But yet, historical perspectives show that migration has been a very normal aspect of social life, especially social change, throughout history. And the reason for this expansion of migration, especially over long distances since the 16th century, was due to the acceleration of the capitalist market, the capitalist world market, right? So migration has been there, it's been there historically. Capitalism and the expansion of capitalist markets also led to an acceleration of migration. And then you also had the formation of nation states, colonial expansion, imperialism that involved conflict and violence, development-induced displacement. All of these led to an increase in migration. Some of this migration is voluntary, other kinds of migration are involuntary. But migration also has positive consequences for migrants and their communities of origin. And there is a body of literature which shows that that people move from areas where incomes are low, opportunities are fewer, to places where economic growth and innovation present them with new and more opportunities. Now, so therefore you have the return flow of remittances, technology, ideas, and all of these under certain circumstances may lead to positive changes in the areas of origin. And migration also has the potential to enhance human capabilities and well-being. So you have the 2009 Human Development Report, the UN Human Development Report, specifically focused on migration in 2009. The report was titled Overcoming Barriers, Human Mobility and Development. And this report really drew attention to the potential of migration to enhance human capabilities and well-being. Castles also brings to our attention that migration has grown significantly in the last 30 to 40 years because of globalization. And so while on the one hand, as we saw earlier, that only 3.6% of the world's population consists of migrants, and this is a very low number, but this 3.6% or 3 to 4% statistic also obscures the significance of migration as an expression of social change, as a ferment for further change, because, and why is that? That's because it glosses over the highly concentrated nature of migration. So you have cultures of emigration which become established in certain areas of origin. And so while settlement of immigrants is concentrated in developed countries, accounting for 10 to 25% of the population of OECD states, you have many global cities where 20, 30, 40, nearly 50% of population can be migrants. And at the same time, something that we're not discussing in this lecture, but which is also important, is that internal migrants far outnumber international migrants. So even if international migrants are 3.6%, internal migrants are far more in number compared to international migrants. And however, internal migrants also face legal, economic, cultural and social obstacles to migration. So what Castles is arguing is that the problem is not really migration itself, but rather the conditions of inequality under which most south to north migration takes place. And these often lead to marginalization and exploitation for many migrants. Now, Castles then goes on to highlight that development will not reduce migration. Now, this is really fundamental, and that with development you have more migration, and we will talk about the paradoxes of migration and development as in the next class when we discuss De Haas's paper. And the point really is that if there were less inequality and therefore less poverty and less human insecurity, there would not be less migration, but the migration would take place under very different circumstances. So now all of these reasons reflect the difficulty of separating between the social, scientific and the political in the understanding of migration. And Castles argues that claims of academic neutrality can mask a sedentary bias and an unquestioning assumption that migration is a bad thing. And yet, theories of global migration should not be based on normative objective of finding ways of helping people to stay at home. Rather, what theories of migration should do, what they should be based on, is the postulate that migration is a normal part of social relations. They should help us analyze the dynamics of migration, not in isolation, but as a part of complex and varied processes of social change. Thus, Castles argues that if there is a normative goal, it should be not to reduce migration, but to find ways in which it could take place under conditions of equality and respect for human rights. Now, this is something we'll expand upon more as we go along in this lecture. We now come to the hurdles in theoretical advancement in migration studies. Why is it that theory building in migration studies is so difficult? And Stephen Castles attributes this to 7 factors. The first is the problem of interdisciplinarity. Now, since migration embraces all dimensions of social existence, it demands an interdisciplinary approach. However, Castles argues that attempts at interdisciplinarity have been too often more additive than integrative. That is, they add disciplines and they add what various disciplines are saying rather than integrating the perspectives of various disciplines. And so therefore, each discipline kind of contributes aspects susceptible to every discipline's ways of functioning, their modes of analysis, but without an overarching synthesis between disciplines, right? And so, like we discussed even in the very first class about how it's important to talk across disciplines, but in reality this doesn't really happen very much. And then of course there is the problem of fragmentation, not just between disciplines but also within disciplines. And for instance, Castles uses the example in economics, and he says that the schisms or the divisions between neoclassical economic theory and the new economics of labor migration are very, very profound. Similarly, in sociology, the distance is too wide between historical institutional approaches that are largely structural in nature compared to functionalist approaches, right? So therefore, it's hard for an interdisciplinary field like migration studies to develop an agreed body of literature, an agreed body of knowledge, and this problem, Castle says, has really compounded in the last 30 to 40 years. And so as new researchers enter migration studies, what they do is they anchor their work in the conceptual and methodological tools of their disciplines, whatever the discipline might be. Sociology, economics, political science, law, history. And the other thing is about how academia is structured. So the incentive structures of discipline-based academic hierarchy make this very hard to avoid, right? And academia is very disciplinary. So a field like migration studies, which by nature, by structure is interdisciplinary, ends up being problematic. And so therefore, the result that you have is that migration research is compartmentalized with little analytical and methodological collaboration across different disciplines, across disciplinary boundaries. And therefore, this disciplinary bias has meant that we end up using reductionist approaches, right? We look only through the lens of specific disciplines, and in doing so, we focus on limited aspects of the migratory experience, blocking an understanding of the entire migratory process. The second hurdle that Castles refers to is on the basis of spatial or functional criteria. That migration studies is split into research on the causes, processes and patterns of migration. So you have the causes and impact studied separately, you have immigrant assimilation being studied separately, the causes and determinants being studied separately, research on how migrants become incorporated being studied separately. So all of this sort of leads to fragmentation, right? Similarly, researchers on internal migration often have little exchange with researchers working on international migration, even though the causes and consequences of both are similar. In a similar way, in less developed countries, the focus is largely on migration and poverty, and poverty research is taken as a starting point by migration researchers. So therefore, these may be linked poorly with other areas of migration research. Similarly, studies of migration are also linked with area studies, studies linked with specific regions such as African studies, Middle Eastern studies and so on. And so therefore, they may be formulated in spatially specific terms, looking at specific areas or regions, and maybe in little dialogue with researchers or social scientists working elsewhere. And then of course, you have post-migration research, which is quite often separate from other areas of migration studies. And now in post-migration research, you have two distinct subfields. One is in the global north, where there's a focus on asylum and refugees, and in the global south, when there's a focus on humanitarian issues. Then you also have an emerging subfield of migration and development. And this migration and development subfield has tried to cross disciplinary boundaries, but it's also been too caught up with politics and policies in migration, and in its relatively short history, it has not really been able to contribute strongly to theory formation. And last, Castles argues that migration scholars tend to be highly specialized, and therefore each subfield has a distinct literature, a separate body of knowledge, and you have separate research centers, journals, conferences. So a result of all of this is that there is an overarching failure to understand the historical character of migration, and there are often false assumptions of one-way causality and an inability to understand the overall dynamics of migratory processes and their embeddedness in processes of social change. The third hurdle to theory building in migration studies, according to Castles, is the closeness to political and bureaucratic agendas. Now, in social science in general, there is a problem of methodological nationalism, which is giving primacy to the nation state as a unit of analysis. And this is at the core of social science theory building, and this problem is even more severe in migration studies. We will focus on methodological nationalism in detail in the next week, but for now it's important to kind of know, and it's sufficient at this moment to understand, that methodological nationalism is when we give primacy to the nation state as a unit of analysis. The other problem is that of government commissioned work. Very often government commissions policy driven work, which can mean then that the research questions, methods, even findings may be shaped by policy interests. Now, policy driven research often provides very simplistic short term remedies to complex long term social issues. And Castles argues that much policy driven research is not only bad social science, but it's also a poor guide to successful policy formation. And one of the reasons for the poor record for governments in this area is that policy research does not make good social science theory. And of course, the recent politicization of issues of migration and incorporation has really sharpened the dilemma of policy driven research. And Castles draws our attention to the fact that governments have commissioned large volume of research on these topics. And therefore, this has provided funding for empirical work, opened up new research areas, and encouraged the expansion of migration studies. But none of this kind of work really contributes to serious theory building. The fourth hurdle to theory building in migration studies is the receiving country bias. And this is a long-term bias, it continues, and that most migration research has taken the situation in northern destination countries as a starting point, neglecting perspectives of origin and transit countries and that of migrants. Though some of this has changed recently, but the dominant policy emphasis in Europe is still on the costs and benefits of receiving society, right? And on questions of migration control, which are more euphemistically known as migration management. So, one reflection of this is the renewed preoccupation with assimilation. So, Castles tells us that in the 1970s and 80s, many countries had shifted away from assimilationist approaches to migrants and minorities. And there was a trend towards multiculturalism, there was a trend towards diversity, which came to a halt in the 1990s. And this largely came to a halt in face of political and media claims of supposed threats to national identity and security from migrants in the global north, especially Muslim migrants. So when multiculturalism, pluralism, diversity came to a halt in the 1990s, new policy trends were reflected in a revamping of social scientific theories of assimilation. So you have neo-assimilationist approaches which have recently been joined by discourses on social cohesion, social capital, which actually claim that diversity endangers the solidarity on which democratic nation states are founded. Now, such social scientific accounts have in turn helped to justify changes in national policies such as the introduction of integration contracts, citizenship tests that you have in countries such as France, Germany, Britain, Netherlands, Australia. And this lens of neo-assimilationist approaches is also very helpful in understanding current US immigration policies. The fifth hurdle to theory building, according to Castles, is the isolation of migration studies from broader trends in contemporary social theory. So, Castles argues that migration scholars often find themselves marginalized within the social sciences, and this is because many leading social theorists do not consider migration as an important area of study or investigation. Now, the fact that migration studies cuts across disciplinary boundaries is one reason why it's gained such little acceptance in mainstream departments. Because mainstream departments are based on disciplinarity, and in academia disciplinarity is quite strong. So therefore, you have migration research often takes place in dedicated research centers and depends heavily on external funding. And then this forces migration researchers to take on policy-driven consultancy work, which in turn confirms the prejudice against interdisciplinary study on part of mainstream social scientists. The sixth hurdle to theory formation, according to Castles, is the complexity and diversity of migration experiences. Now, let us look at an example of what we have covered in the course so far. So, the neoclassical approach assumes that migration or movement is motivated by the desire for individual income maximization, and it's based on a rational comparison of the costs and benefits in source and destination areas. And now over here then, the very existence of economic disparities between source and destination regions is kind of sufficient to generate migration flows. Now, in the long run then, such flows will lead to a convergence of wages and conditions between underdeveloped and developed regions, as we have discussed in the previous classes. Now, in the long run, such flows should help equalize wages and conditions in underdeveloped and developed regions. So, there will be a convergence of wages leading towards economic equilibrium. Now, as we discussed earlier, this model was developed to analyze internal movements in developing countries, but it can be seen as being applicable to international migration too. And this neoclassical model suggests a long-term transition to a one sector, relatively full employment neoclassical world. Now, however, the neoclassical model has not proved to be very useful in analyzing and explaining actual migration experiences. It has a very narrow focus on income maximization, on convergence of wages, and its assumption of rational economic decision making actually has very little to do with the reality or with the empirics of most migration flows. And so therefore, this has led to some economists, social scientists criticizing neoclassical methodological individualism. So what is methodological individualism? When the individual is given primacy as a unit of analysis in research, that is methodological individualism. And we will also discuss more on methodological individualism next week. Now, so the new economics of labor migration, which came after neoclassical economic theories of migration, focuses on family strategies for income maximization and risk diversification. So, the NELM researchers, as we saw earlier, they use ethnographic research methods such as qualitative interviews, household studies to understand migration decisions. but the emphasis is retained on rational economic decision making. And however, Castles argues that NELM theories still largely do not take into account many non-economic factors that shape migration. So, to deal with this, Collinson suggests the need for a political economy approach to migration that links the analysis of local level factors that influence people's migration decisions, livelihood strategies, with political, economic, and social factors that affect the agency of a migrant. So, then you can see there's a great deal of complexity in migratory processes. Economic factors are important, but they are hardly ever sufficient to understand any specific experience. Complexity also implies diversity, and Castles tells us if there are so many factors at work, the possible combinations become infinite. So, this in turn points to the crucial role of context, the links between migration and other economic, social, political, and cultural relationships at work in particular places at a particular historical juncture. So, therefore, a historical understanding of societies and the relationship between them is also crucial. And for all of these reasons, then, theory building is hard. Which brings us to our last point about why theory building in migration studies is hard, and that is for all the reasons discussed so far, grand theorization or one single theory of migration is not possible. So, what Castles does is, Castles argues that we should focus on middle range theorizing. What does he mean by this? First, that we should take the form of a broad conceptual framework. Theory should take the form of a broad conceptual framework which can help integrate the analysis of specific migratory processes by the various social science disciplines. However, the framework cannot use various theoretical approaches in an arbitrary manner by way of choosing bits and pieces from here and there that fit and leaving out those that do not. What we need is a conceptual framework that needs to be capable of accommodating all the factors and interactions that shape a given migratory process. However, this does not mean producing a contradiction-free analysis. Remember, there is complexity in migration processes, and so a lack of coherence in findings across disciplines and paradigms and methodologies may be an important indicator of knowledge and research gaps, and they can also help us show the need to revise conceptual framework. And so therefore, this is really how middle range theory develops without ever aspiring to present a universally valid truth. Castles is very clear that the most important way to achieve advancement in migration studies is to link it more closely with wider social theory. So, we need to conceptualize migration not merely as a result of social transformation, nor as one of its causes, but as an integral and essential part of social transformation processes. So, therefore, Castles is critical of studies which look at migration as separate from other social and economic processes, right? So, the idea that causes and impact need to be studied separately, the idea that migration has social impacts that need to be looked at separately, and political impacts that need to be looked at separately, and economic impacts that need to be looked at separately is not something that fits in this theory. Instead, what Castles is doing is, Castles is encouraging us to look at migration as an essential part of social change and social transformation. And to do this then, it means that theories of migration should be embedded in broader social theory. It also means that research on any specific migration phenomena must always include research on the societal context in which it takes place. And finally, because awareness of change starts usually at the local level, it is important to link local level experiences of migration, whether they're in origin areas or in destination areas, with other socio-spatial levels and particularly with global processes. And at last, Castle argues that we can draw on emerging ideas from a range of disciplines to develop a new approach to understanding transformation, migration, relationships. For this, and as an example of middle range theorizing on migration and labor force dynamics, I encourage you to read and engage with Castle's paper. So with this, we come to the end of this lecture. In this lecture, we looked at a seminal paper by Stephen Castles titled Understanding Global Migration, a Social Transformation Perspective. In the next class, we will look at the migration and development perspective, focusing largely on this emerging and now fairly well-established area of research within migration studies. And we will also look at it critically. We will look at De Haase's work on the paradoxes of migration and development, and at the same time we would also look at some critical development studies literature that emphasizes on a critique of the migration and development perspective. So with this, we come to the end of this class. Thank you very much.